All right, let's jump right into this explainer. When we think about World War II resistance movements, we usually picture highly trained operatives right out of the gate. But the Danish resistance, it's fascinating exactly because it didn't start that way at all. No, it began with ideological outcasts, some incredibly strange alliances, and just a sheer refusal to accept the occupation. So today, we're going to walk through the wild timeline of how totally isolated acts of sabotage snowballed into the historic 1944 People's Strike.
Now, to really get the political status quo here, we've got to understand what Denmark was like early in the war. The Danish government was functioning under occupation, and they were strictly anti-communist. I mean, look at this quote. Prime Minister Thorvald Stauning, a social democrat, made his stance crystal clear right before Denmark signed the Anti-Comintern Pact in 1941. So what does this mean? It means the early communist resistance wasn't just fighting the Nazis. They were literally fighting the ideological stance of their very own national leaders. The Communist Party of Denmark was officially banned by German authorities in 1942, which forced them entirely underground.
And that brings us to this really fascinating core conflict. How did a persecuted, officially outlawed political group manage to help unite an entire nation? Right? It's like a giant puzzle. The communists were completely isolated, they were outlawed, and yet they somehow formed the nucleus of the most effective sabotage efforts in the country. To see how they actually pulled this off, we need to look at how they went from being a tiny group of outcasts to a highly structured legal organization.
Let's take a look at the timeline. Within just a couple of years, things escalate incredibly fast. After the 1942 ban, the communists start organizing these small, grassroots sabotage cells. Now, these were primarily made up of veterans who'd actually fought in the Spanish Civil War. They called themselves COPA, Communist Partisans. But then, as you can see, January 1943 hits, and there's a massive shift. They actually join forces with students, rebrand themselves as BOPA, and from there, the whole thing just explodes into massive industrial sabotage campaigns throughout 1943 and 1944. But you have to remember, at the very beginning, these early resistance fighters had almost nothing. I mean, a sheer scarcity of weapons, no military-grade explosives, no fancy airdropped supplies. They were making do with incredibly basic everyday materials. We're talking gasoline, matches, and this totally illegal manual put together by a guy named A.J. Larson. The underground affectionately called it the cookbook. And this cookbook basically taught members how to build simple, time-delayed incendiary and explosive devices using whatever civilian junk they could scrounge up. This was incredibly dangerous, totally grassroots warfare.
So to actually grow their capabilities, these scrappy communist veterans had to make some pretty strange bedfellows. See, initially, they deeply distrusted academics and these, elitist students. They actually refused to let them join. But then, January 25th, 1943 happens. A group of those exact rejected students decide to just take matters into their own hands. Armed with literally nothing but a bottle of spirits, they managed to set fire to a whole stockpile of German listening devices at a facility in Hellerup. It was such a daring, incredibly low-tech attack that it completely proved their worth, and the communists finally said, "Okay, you're in."
I absolutely love this next detail because it perfectly captures the dark humor of the era and just how mismatched this group really was. So, with the students on board, the old acronym COPA just didn't fit anymore. Enter BOPA. It stands for Borgerlige Partisaner, meaning civil or conservative partisans. But here's the kicker. It actually started out as a joke. It was an ironic, mocking jab by the original working-class communists aimed squarely at these middle-class conservative students who had just joined up. But you know how it goes. The name stuck, and it went on to become the legendary title of one of Denmark's most feared resistance units.
As the war dragged on, the whole resistance movement really diversified. While BOPA grew to about 175 members and kept a laser focus on heavy industrial sabotage, another major player hit the scene, Holger Danske. Named after a mythic Danish hero, this group was larger, roughly 350 members by the end of the war, and they took a much more militarized approach. So while BOPA is out there blowing up factories, Holger Danske became famous for highly targeted operations. They ended up taking responsibility for eliminating around 200 informers who had compromised resistance members. It's just a fascinating look at how these radically different ideological factions organize themselves to fight the occupation in their own unique ways. Now, circling back to BOPA. As their sabotage operations escalated, they got incredibly strategic. They started leveraging inside knowledge from young apprentices working inside these huge industrial plants to strike massive blows against the German war machine. I mean, we're talking major targets. The Burmeister and Wayne shipyard, Riffel-Syndikatet, which was a crucial arms factory. They even took out Globus, a factory pumping out bicycles for the German military. These definitely weren't just random acts of vandalism, right? These were highly calculated, devastating strikes on supply chains, and they were often pulling these attacks off in broad daylight.
10 million. That number right there is 10 million kroner. And that is the staggering amount of financial damage BOPA inflicted on the Riffel Syndicate factory alone during a single attack in June of 1944. Their operatives actually managed to plant a massive 400-kilogram explosive payload right inside the facility. To put that into perspective for you, this was the single largest amount of sabotage damage recorded during the entire occupation. So yeah, they had definitely evolved way beyond matches and gasoline. They were completely leveling critical military infrastructure at this point.
Which brings us to the climax of our explainer today, the 1944 People's Strike, also known as the Folkestreiken.
So up until the summer of 1944, the resistance had been mostly covert. But you mix this constant, heavy sabotage with increasingly brutal crackdowns by the occupying forces, and you get a massive pressure cooker in Copenhagen. The spark finally ignited on Monday, June 26, 1944. German authorities had just clamped down with strict curfews, and this Nazi-aligned Danish terror group, the Schalburg Korsbett, had been waging a horrific, violent campaign against the public. They had actually just blown up parts of the beloved Tivoli Gardens a few days prior. So in direct, spontaneous protest, an opposition social democrat named Paul Nielsen says enough. He initiates a walkout, leading 1,200 workers from the Burmeister and Wayne shipyard to just drop their tools and go home before the curfew even hit.
And this sets off an unbelievable chain reaction. As workers walked out and everyday citizens started openly defying the curfew by literally dragging furniture into the streets to build barricades, the German civilian commander, Werner Best, totally panics. Step 1, he declares full military martial law on Friday, July 1st, cutting the city off. Step 2, the underground Danish Freedom Council, the Fridagsrådet, fires right back, immediately calling for a total general strike until martial law is lifted. And then step 3, in a brutal act of retaliation, the Germans completely cut off the gas, the water, and the electricity to the entire city of Copenhagen. 51. Tragically, that was the human cost of the street battles that erupted next. With all the utilities cut and the whole city locked down, you'd think people would surrender. But they didn't back down. They just reinforced their barricades. In response, German soldiers actually opened fire directly on the Danish civilian population. Over those incredibly tense days, 51 people were killed, and over 300 were wounded right there in the streets of Copenhagen. It was this terrifying, brutal standoff between a largely unarmed populace and a fully equipped occupying military force. But here's the crazy part. The strike was so paralyzingly effective that it caught the attention of Adolf Hitler himself. See, Denmark was heavily relied upon for agricultural exports. It was literally known as Germany's breadbasket, and Hitler was absolutely furious. He was livid that his own commander, Werner Best, had provoked this total shutdown of a vital supply line, all because of public executions and curfews. So to save his precious agricultural pipeline, Hitler actually intervenes directly. He blames his own guy and orders an immediate de-escalation. And the aftermath of all this is just incredible. This totally unprecedented unified civilian stand actually forced the occupying Nazi forces to compromise. Think about that. The demands of the resistance were largely met. Werner Best was forced to lift martial law. That despised terror group, the Schalburg confined to their barracks. And German troops were strictly banned from shooting at civilians. Realizing they had just pulled off this massive political and moral victory, the Resistance Council officially called an end to the strike, and the citizens of Copenhagen triumphantly marched back to work on July 6th. So, to wrap up our explainer today, I really want to leave you with this final provocative thought. We started out by looking at a government that signed treaties with its occupiers, right? And we looked at communists and students who were completely marginalized. Yet, it was exactly those outcasts, armed at first with nothing but matches and a willingness to act, who ultimately mobilized an entire city and forced a global superpower to blink. It really makes you wonder, in times of ultimate crisis, when the political status quo compromises just to survive, who is it that really ends up defending the soul of the nation? Thanks so much for walking through this incredible piece of history with me today. Keep asking those tough questions, and I'll catch you in the next explainer.